During World War II, Paris was the main stage for art sales and art collectors. There have been reports that as many as 25,000 paintings were confiscated during World War II in Paris alone. Some of the significant art movements that took place in France during the 1940s were Fauvism, Cubism, and Surrealism. Fauvism comes from the French word fauve, which means wild beast. The style was first adopted by Henri Matisse in the early 19th century. Fauvism featured painting in a spontaneous, crude manner using bold color combinations applied directly from the paint tube. Cubism was begun by Pablo Picasso and George Braque in the early 20th century. This style was abstract and featured fragmentation, multiple viewpoints, and reducing everyday objects and sights to geometric forms. Surrealism was also popular in France. It was begun in France and eventually spread to the rest of Europe, the United States, and Latin America. Surrealism was influenced by hallucinatory writings of 19th century poets and Sigmund Freud's theory of the unconsciousness. This form of art explored the unconscious mind, drew heavily from images from dreams, and depicted everyday objects in strange conditions, often juxtaposing them to suggest alternate reality. Literature in France flourished during the early to mid-20th century. The writers of the Lost Generation significantly contributed to the large output of a renowned body of literary work, not just in France, but also throughout Europe leading up to 1950. During the 1940s in France, the literature style of surrealism died out. Meanwhile, more experimental writing emerged. The roots of existentialism can also be traced back to French literature during this period. Throughout the 1940s, France's prime role as an iconic fashion city decreased slightly due to the country's involvement in World War II. Of course, French fashion was still largely influential, but France's declining presence in fashion allowed new designs to come into the main scene. During the 1940s, women in France wore considerably shorter clothing than women wore in France in earlier decades. This was due to the fact that the notion of a woman exposing parts of her body was becoming more acceptable, in addition to the widespread rationing efforts occurring in France and other countries during the war. Other fashion trends followed by women in France included the backless dress, short sleeves, pullover sweaters, and an overall style of clothing meant to emphasize a woman's natural curves. While fashion for women was quickly evolving, fashion for men did not change as much. However, there were some changes in men's fashion, including suits becoming more of an everyday fashion, as well as the pairing of sweaters and breeches becoming an acceptable outfit for men during the day. French cooking during the 1940s can be epitomized by Gertrude Stein's statement, "the perfection of simple dishes." To coincide with this idea, the time period saw the decreased use of heavy sauces. Sauces became, as Stein says, simple and perfect. In addition, common ingredients replaced expensive ones. Overall, French cooking was a major asset to social life in the cities as well as to family life in the countryside. The quote from Stein talks about the French people's need to distract themselves during war. Leisure activities were a great way to take people's minds off the destruction that was happening around them. Leisure time during the 20th century increased for people in France, as well as in other parts of the world. Radio broadcasting remained popular throughout the 1940s. However, during the 1940s, television did not have a huge foothold in France due to the war. Music was an ever popular leisure activity in France during the 1940s. Listening to music was a much-needed distraction and a soothing mechanism at a time when war was ravaging the land. French people during the war also spent significant time as family units. Since many people fled to the quaint countryside, there wasn't much else to do besides hang out with parents and siblings. It is also important to note that during World War II, with the United States' growing influence in global affairs, French households started enjoying what were traditionally known as American activities. Not until after World War II did this phenomenon, Americanization, as Gertrude Stein liked to call it, become extremely evident in France.